There is a concept in political science called the authoritarian's dilemma. It describes a trap that is not built by enemies. It is not built by foreign alliances or hostile intelligence services or economic sanctions or military ultimatums. It is built by the authoritarian himself, brick by brick, decision by decision. Each choice made with internal logic, each step producing a consequence that the next step was designed to manage, until the accumulated weight of every managed consequence becomes a structure with no exit. The authoritarian's dilemma is not that the leader makes bad decisions, it is that he makes decisions that are rational within his system and catastrophic in their cumulative effect. And by the time the cumulative effect is visible, the system he has built around himself, the political architecture, the information environment, the loyalty structures, the public narrative, makes reversing course more dangerous than continuing forward. Vladimir Putin has spent 25 years building the most sophisticated authoritarian system in the post-Soviet world. Last week, that system ran out of room. Not because NATO issued the first direct, unconditional ultimatum in the alliance's 76-year history, though it did. Not because Putin's response stunned every foreign minister and defense secretary and intelligence chief in Brussels and Norfolk and Ramstein, though it did. But because of what Putin's response revealed about the space that is left inside the system he built. And the space that is left is very small. Today, I'm going to show you something that neither NATO's official communications nor Russian state television will say directly. I am going to show you the specific mechanism by which Putin's own decisions, the invasion, the Kaliningrad militarization, the drone incursions, the war economy, have created a set of constraints so tight that his response to a NATO ultimatum was not defiance, not escalation, not the kind of strategic countermove that Western analysts spent 2 years expecting from a former KGB officer who sees every game 10 steps ahead. His response was to ask for a meeting. And in the geography of this confrontation, asking for a meeting when you have just been given an ultimatum you cannot accept is not diplomacy. It is the sound of a trap closing. Let's get into it. NATO does not act on impulse. It is an alliance of 32 nations, 32 foreign ministries, 32 defense establishments, 32 parliamentary systems with 32 sets of domestic political constraints that range from Hungary's Orban, who has spent 3 years trying to maintain working relationships with Moscow, to Estonia's government, which shares a land border with Russia and has been saying since 2022 that the management approach would eventually fail. Getting all 32 of those governments to agree on anything consequential requires months of negotiation, compromise, and the kind of painstaking diplomatic architecture that produces consensus only when the alternative to consensus is more frightening than the consensus itself. For 76 years, the alternative to consensus on a direct ultimatum to Russia was always more frightening, because the alternative included the word nuclear. And the word nuclear made every NATO government, regardless of how alarmed its intelligence services were, regardless of how aggressive Russian behavior became, default to the management approach. the careful, calibrated, patient management of a dangerous adversary that the alliance had practiced since 1949. Three things happened in the weeks before the ultimatum that moved every one of those 32 governments past the threshold where management felt more dangerous than confrontation. The first was the intelligence picture. Western intelligence services, the NSA, GCHQ, Germany's BND, France's DGSE, and the Baltic and Nordic services that have been tracking Russian military movements with an intensity born from geography, assembled a collection of indicators that individually could be contextualized and managed. Together, they could not. Specific unit repositioning, forward staging of logistics assets, activation of command and control facilities, the signature pattern that analysts call indicator and warning because it precedes action the way a barometric drop precedes a storm. Not a confirmed imminent attack, something more consequential, preparation. The kind that once begun is harder to stand down from than to continue. The second was Kaliningrad, Russia's Baltic exclave, 223 square kilometers of Russian territory surrounded by Poland and Lithuania, separated from the Russian mainland by 400 kilometers of NATO territory, has been quietly but unmistakably transformed over 14 months. The S-500 air defense system, deployed in a configuration that NATO analysts assessed as oriented not to defend Kaliningrad from air attack, but to project anti-access coverage into the Baltic Sea and the airspace over Poland and the Baltic states. Iskander ballistic missile systems, force levels inconsistent with garrison defense and consistent with something else. The third was Estonia. A Russian military drone crossed the Estonian border, flew 31 kilometers into Estonian territory, turned back. It was the fifth such incursion, and the fifth incursion came 3 days after Russia's ambassador to Tallinn had publicly, on camera, assured Estonian officials that Russian military aircraft were operating strictly within Russian airspace. The ambassador had lied, demonstrably, documentably, on camera. When the Estonian foreign minister presented the evidence to the NATO Council, 32 diplomatic delegations went simultaneously quiet in a way that career NATO officials described as unlike anything in their professional experience. The ultimatum was drafted that week. The ultimatum has 3 elements, all confirmed through multiple sources with access to NATO internal communications. Element 1, Kaliningrad. Russia must withdraw the S-500 batteries and Iskander ballistic missile systems positioned in Kaliningrad over the past 14 months. Return the exclave's military posture to pre-February 2022 levels. Verified through satellite imagery, OSCE monitoring mechanisms, and direct observation by NATO military personnel at a mutually agreed point. Element 2, airspace. Russia must immediately seize the documented drone incursion pattern across Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, and the Norwegian maritime boundary. Not an investigation, not a commitment to look into incidents, a cessation, backed by a formal Russian acknowledgement that the incursions occurred, an acknowledgement that would constitute a documented admission of deliberate territorial violation. Element 3, Ukraine. Russia must commit to negotiated withdrawal from all occupied Ukrainian territory within a framework defined by Ukraine and its allies. Not a ceasefire that freezes current lines, not peace talks where Russia negotiates the terms of what it keeps. A process in which Ukraine defines what return to Ukrainian sovereignty means. The first two elements are demanding. They are visible, verifiable, and politically painful to execute. The third element is in a different category entirely. The lands Russia has occupied, declared part of the Russian Federation, incorporated into Russian constitutional law, defended with the language of existential national survival and the protection of Russian speakers from what Kremlin messaging calls genocide, those lands cannot be placed on a table for return to Ukrainian sovereignty without destroying the political narrative that has justified everything the Russian state has done since February 24th, 2022. Every casualty, every mobilization, every economic sacrifice, every mother who was told her son died protecting Russian land. If that land goes back to Ukraine, what did they die for? Putin cannot answer that question and survive the answer. The alliance knew this when they drafted the third element, which brings me to the part that changes the entire picture. This is not cynicism, it is strategy. And understanding it as strategy explains everything about NATO's current posture that seems contradictory when viewed through the conventional lens of diplomatic demands meant to produce compliance. NATO issued this ultimatum to three audiences simultaneously. To Russia, the management posture is over. The alliance is no longer calibrating its Ukraine support to prevent escalation. It is confronting the escalation that has already occurred. To Ukraine, 32 NATO nations are now formally aligned with Ukrainian territorial integrity in a way that makes future Western pressure on Kiev to accept territorial compromise significantly more politically costly. Walking back a formal NATO Council decision is categorically harder than walking back an informal statement of principle. To the alliance itself, specifically to the members whose domestic pressures have been pushing toward accommodation, Hungary, Slovakia, elements of the German coalition, the ultimatum forced every NATO member to vote yes or vote no. All 32 voted yes. All 32 are now politically committed to the consequences of Russian non-compliance. NATO did not issue this ultimatum hoping Russia would accept it. NATO issued this ultimatum to make Russian non-compliance the legal and political trigger for the next phase of alliance action. The ambassadors of 32 nations were seated around a circular table in the NATO Council chamber in Brussels when the Russian response arrived. Representatives of countries that have been inside the alliance for decades, alongside representatives of Finland and Sweden, nations that spent 80 years outside it, and joined only because Russian behavior made neutrality feel more dangerous than commitment. They had prepared for defiance, modeled defiance, war-gamed defiance. Putin's response was not defiance. He acknowledged the ultimatum directly. This itself was unprecedented. Russia has managed Western pressure for 3 years through denial, deflection, and counter-accusation, refusing to engage with the premise of demands it characterizes as illegitimate. Putin acknowledged the ultimatum. and then he asked for a meeting. Not a bilateral channel to Washington, not a backdoor communication through intermediaries, a formal public request for a meeting of the NATO-Russia Council, the forum suspended since 2022, to discuss what he called NATO's unprecedented and destabilizing ultimatum in the context of Russia's legitimate security concerns. The room went quiet because a request for dialogue issued in response to an ultimatum by a leader who has spent 2 years refusing every substantive diplomatic engagement is not the response of a man operating from strength. It is the response of a man who needs time. And the question that every NATO intelligence service began working on the moment that response arrived was the same question. Why does he need time? The answer lives in 3 data points that have emerged from Russian military and economic reporting over the past 60 days. Each one individually can be contextualized. Together, they describe something that Russia's leadership cannot acknowledge publicly and cannot fix quickly. Number 1, 63%. Russia's military recruitment for the current fiscal year is running at 63% of target. The volunteer force model, the alternative to a second general mobilization that would tell every Russian family the war is not going as claimed, is not producing the required numbers. The men willing to sign 18-month combat contracts for elevated pay have largely done so. The remaining pool requires either a draft with all its domestic political consequences or a gradual thinning of frontline forces that cannot sustain the offensive tempo that Putin's public narrative demands. A second general mobilization is not just politically costly, it is an admission that the special military operation that was supposed to conclude in 72 hours has consumed 2.5 years and still requires more Russians to die. Number 2, 11,000 to 13,000. Russian artillery expenditure, the most reliable operational sustainability metric available to outside analysts, has dropped from its peak of approximately 20,000 shells per day in summer 2023 to a current rate that Western estimates place at 11,000 to 13,000 per day. This is not a tactical choice. Russia did not decide to fire fewer shells because fewer shells are needed. It is a supply constraint. North Korean transfers and domestic production increases have not compensated for the rate of consumption in the grinding attritional battles of the Donetsk front. Artillery is how Russia fights. Artillery is how Russian military doctrine has always compensated for tactical limitations in combined arms integration. Fewer shells means a different war than the one Russian commanders are trained and equipped to fight. Number 3, 21%. The Russian central bank's benchmark interest rate, 21%. This is not the interest rate of an economy managing wartime friction. This is the interest rate of an economy fighting hyperinflationary pressure, suppressing capital flight, and rationing credit in ways that are already constraining the defense industrial expansion Putin has made the centerpiece of his war economy. Consumer price inflation is running at 15% in official statistics, significantly higher in the informal measurements Russians actually use to assess what food, fuel, and medicine cost. The social contract Putin has maintained for 25 years, accept political constraints in exchange for rising living standards, has been suspended. Russians are now being asked to accept political constraints and declining living standards simultaneously. That combination has a historical signature in Russia. It is the condition that makes systems brittle. Three numbers: 63, 11 to 13,000, 21. Putin needs time because all three of those numbers are moving in the wrong direction simultaneously, and he has no fast solution for any of them. NATO did not say yes to a meeting. It did not say no. It said the conditions for a NATO-Russia Council meeting are clear and unchanged. Verifiable withdrawal of offensive systems from Kaliningrad, cessation of airspace violations with formal Russian acknowledgement, demonstrated commitment to Ukrainian territorial integrity. In diplomatic language, this is conditionality. In strategic language, it is a second trap inside the first one, because the conditions NATO attached to any meeting are conditions Russia cannot meet without publicly reversing positions its entire domestic political narrative depends on. Withdrawing the Kaliningrad systems is a visible, satellite-documented act that Russian state media, which has spent 3 years telling the Russian people that NATO is the aggressor and Russia the defender, cannot explain as anything other than capitulation. But refusing the conditions while pursuing the meeting request puts Russia in the posture of a party that wants the appearance of negotiation without the substance of it. And in an alliance of 32 democracies whose public opinion is the ultimate policy constraint, the appearance of Russian bad faith, seeking dialogue while refusing the reasonable steps that make dialogue possible, is politically valuable to every NATO government that needs to maintain domestic support for continued confrontation. Putin's meeting request handed the alliance a gift. It gave NATO the posture of the party willing to talk. It gave Russia the posture of the party that talks about talking while doing nothing that talking requires. And while Russia is occupying that posture, NATO is building. Germany reversed a planned defense budget reduction and announced an 18 billion euro emergency supplemental for military readiness. The Bundeswehr is conducting Baltic exercises at a scale not seen since reunification. Poland accelerated the Eastern Shield program, anti-tank barriers, bunker systems, hardened logistics nodes along the Polish-Belarusian border in the Suwałki corridor, the 65-kilometer gap between Kaliningrad and Belarus that is NATO's most geographically vulnerable point. Being built faster and denser than the original timeline envisioned. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, jointly requested activation of NATO's enhanced forward presence from battalion to brigade level. Current battalion-sized battle groups are sufficient to trigger Article 5 obligations. Brigade-sized formations can actually slow, absorb, and potentially defeat a Russian conventional assault long enough for alliance reinforcement to arrive. The Baltics are not preparing for an attack they believe is coming next week. They are preparing for one their intelligence services assess as possible within 36 months, and building now, while the alliance is unified, while political will exists in every NATO capital, before the next election cycle changes the picture in a dozen member states. Putin asked for time. NATO is using that time to build everything he cannot stop. Go back to the beginning. The authoritarian's dilemma, a trap built not by enemies, but by the leader's own decisions, each rational within his system, each producing consequences his system cannot absorb. Putin decided to invade Ukraine. The operation he believed would take 72 hours is now in its third year, with no military resolution visible. Putin decided to militarize Kaliningrad. The decision that was meant to project Russian power into the Baltic produced the specific provocation that gave NATO's most cautious members, Germany, Hungary, Slovakia, no political cover left for continued accommodation. Putin authorized the drone incursions into Estonian airspace. The incursions that produced the documentable lie by Russia's ambassador that made 32 NATO governments simultaneously conclude that the management approach had reached its end. Each decision was logical within the framework. Each decision produced a consequence the framework was not designed to absorb. And now the accumulated weight of those consequences has produced a NATO ultimatum that Putin cannot accept, conditions for dialogue he cannot meet, a domestic political system that cannot survive visible retreat, a military facing simultaneous resource constraints on personnel and ammunition and economics, and a request for time that the alliance is using to build the military infrastructure that makes future Russian aggression against NATO territory a catastrophe rather than a gamble. 76 years. The alliance spent 76 years not issuing this ultimatum because the risk of direct confrontation with a nuclear power always outweighed the cost of one more round of management. That calculation changed on February 24th, 2022. Not immediately, gradually, through 2.5 years of watching management fail in real time, through casualty counts and destroyed cities, and 5 drone incursions, and a lying ambassador, and an intelligence picture that had stopped being ambiguous. The ultimatum is not the beginning of this confrontation. It is the alliance's formal acknowledgement that the confrontation has already been underway for 2.5 years, and that the tools used to manage it are not the tools adequate to resolve it. Putin's response, asking for a meeting, buying time, hoping something changes, is the response of a leader who built a system that cannot back down and a war that cannot end on terms his system can survive. The clock is running, and it is running against the side that needs time to fix 3 numbers that do not fix quickly. The side with 63% recruitment, 11 to 13,000 shells, and a 21% interest rate. If this analysis reached you before the mainstream coverage connected these pieces, share it with someone who still thinks this confrontation has a diplomatic off-ramp that doesn't require one side to change what it fundamentally is. Subscribe because we don't cover the ultimatum. We cover the architecture underneath it.